Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to the wild Vaughn Manor. And it's June on the Range, a whole month devoted to reading Western fiction. I've got a wild gang of co-hosts that I'll link down below, and we're all doing some videos about the Westerns we're reading. And today I'm going to be talking about LAmour. LAmour, the most famous Western writer of all time, the most successful Western writer of all time. If you know someone who's a Western fan, they, without a doubt, have a ton of LAmour books. Because LAmour, he was huge. And like I said, he's one of the most famous Western writers of all time, but he's also one of the most famous writers of all time. At least he was at one time. He was tremendously successful. And so at the beginning of June on the Range, I decided to read, among other things, some LAmour. And I read 2 books by LAmour, and I'm going to be talking about them here today. First book I read was Crossfire Trail. This is Crossfire Trail by LAmour. And then I read this one, Fallon. I like this one an awful lot, so read these 2 fantastic books. And LAmour, recently Steve Donoghue on his channel did some videos on LAmour, did a couple of videos on him. And in his videos, he mentioned that he thought LAmour might be what he would term a natural storyteller, somebody who's popular because he just had a natural knack of telling stories. And one of the criteria Steve Donoghue has for being a natural storyteller is that your stories don't change much from any period in their career. You could pick up a book from the beginning of their career. It's going to be an awful lot like one of the books they pick up that you could pick up from later or towards the end of their career. They'll basically be telling you the same kind of story. That's one of his criteria for being a natural storyteller, which I think LAmour was. There are a few of those who might not be the greatest writers in the world. I think Edgar Rice Burroughs qualifies as being a writer who was also a natural storyteller. Not the greatest writer in the world, but he can tell a story and he understood story values. And I think the same could be said definitely for LAmour. I'm not sure Steve is correct about to be a natural storyteller you can't change over time. I think telling stories and writing, your writing, I think, no matter who you are, is probably going to change somewhat over time. Because you're never going to be the same kind of person when you're in your 60s or 70s as you are when you're in your 20s. So there are going to be some differences, even if you're telling basically the same kinds of stories. Certainly with Edgar Rice Burroughs, he was a different writer when he was writing Beyond the Farthest Star than he was when he was writing A Princess of Mars. For one thing, he'd been through World War II, which changed his attitude towards war considerably, which changed the focus of some of his writing. Although he was still telling adventure stories the same as he always was. I think you probably could find a bit of that in LAmour as well. Although he was remarkably consistent. I think there was a point where his books started getting better, where he became more of a master of his craft. But he was remarkably consistent, and I think he was a natural storyteller. And you could certainly see some of that from the books that I read. This first one that I read, Crossfire Trail, with Rafe Karadec, gambler, soldier of fortune, wanderer from far places. He had made a promise to a dying man to save his ranch in Wyoming for his wife and daughter, and he's gonna keep his promise. Rafe is the typical LAmour hero in that he was a big, tough, strong guy who has a definite moral code no matter how big, tough, and strong he is, he's got a definite moral code. He's basically a really good guy. And so when he made this promise to his friend, he's going to keep this promise. Now, his friend was a rancher who had been shanghaied along with Rafe from San Francisco at the beginning of the story. And as they come back to San Francisco, the captain of the ship just beats this guy to death. He had planned to kill him anyway, so that he could not reveal that he had paid the mortgage on his ranch. The guy he paid the mortgage to wanted this guy out of the way so he can still, take over the ranch. There's a reason this shady character wants to take over the ranch, which you find out in the story. I don't want to give too much away. It's a short little story. But it is kind of a typical Save the Ranch story. In Westerns, you have a lot of Save the Ranch stories, and this is definitely one of them. But it's an awful good one. This is a really well-written story with a lot of action. The character work in here is really, really good as well. He had a natural ability just for writing fast-paced action stories, Louis L'Amour did. Usually he would have one or two female characters, and that's definitely true here, where everybody else is a bunch of men. A lot of them pretty terrible villains. He had a hand for terrible villains as well. His bad guys, man, they were just so bad. But very often, they were not just one-dimensional characters. His bad guys tended to be different from each other. He would have different types of bad guys. You get a couple different types of bad guys in this. And one is just the evil gunman. You get quite a few evil gunmen in this. And one is the shifty politician type. You get a lot of those types of characters in this book. But Rafe Karadec, he's a match for all of that because he's just so darn tough and noble. The main character, the daughter of this rancher, doesn't trust him when he shows up. She trusts the villains because, they have her hoodwinked. But eventually, she ends up trusting Rafe because he's just so darn good. And she starts seeing how sneaky and awful these guys she thought she was trusting were. Like I said, a lot of action in this story, and it runs right along at a really solid clip. As a story, it's probably more predictable than some of his other stories because this is a pretty by-the-numbers, for the most part, save the ranch story. We've got to save the ranch. But I did enjoy it. As a Western, it was really well done. Action, characters, whole thing. You could read this sucker in no time at all. It's really short. How long was this? It's 157 pages. Rolls right by. So this was a good way to start with Louis L'Amour. And this is one of those Louis L'Amour books I had not read. It's kind of tough with Louis L'Amour because he wrote so many books, sometimes you can't remember whether you read them or not. But I had never read this one. And this is one of his earlier Westerns. So that was fun. The next one, though, was really good. This next one was really, really good. This was Fallon. The cover of Fallon cracks me up. So this is about a shifty gambler, as you can see. He was a gambling man. He'd stake his gun, his fortune, his life, but not his girl. Look at him. Of course he'd stake his girl. He's that shifty. And on the back of the book it says, Fallon would bet anything. He lived footloose and fancy-free. He could work the saloons and dance halls all the way from Texas to the last frontier. And he did, until he met the girl. This is in capital letters there. He started playing his cards close to his vest from then on, because this girl was one thing he didn't want to gamble with. She was something he damn well had to have. Actually, that is not true. The entire description to this book is all wrong. We do have Fallon, who's a shifty gambler, but when he meets this girl they're talking about, he didn't even like this girl, and she definitely didn't like him. So that's all nonsense. What this story is actually about, Fallon, who is a gambler and won a bunch of money, had to hightail it out of a town because they all want to lynch him because they don't want to pay him his money. They figure, we'll just hang this guy. So he had to get out of this town right quick. And so he's wandering through the desert on his horse, and he stumbles upon some wagons of some homesteaders. They're going to California. And he says, you know what? He remembers this town that was close by, this ghost town, which at one time was a town that was basically, it was a scam. There was some mines close by that were just nothing. And so they built this big town to basically fleece a bunch of people. And it turned out to be, a big scam, and the town emptied out because there was no reason to stay. So he remembers this town. So he decides, you know what? I'm going to lead these folks to this town and just do basically the same kind of scam where there's there are mines up there. Let's move into this town. We've got a bunch of people that are coming through anyway on their way to California. We can open up some stores, and we can make money off the people that are traveling by doing just what you guys are doing. And he talks this small group of people into it. So they go to this town, and he cleans up the town, renames the town, they open some businesses, and sure enough, homesteaders come through there and they start to make money off the people coming through. And there are still the mines up there that he wants to make money off of. He's trying to find some sucker that he could sell the mines to, even though there's nothing up there. And so this town is actually starts off and actually does surprisingly well. And our guy Fallon here had made believe that he had a deed to the property and that he owned this town when, of course, he didn't. But eventually he comes to feel responsible for this town. And so when there are the shady gunfighters who show up, of course there are going to be gunfighters that show up. And there's some other dangers that happen that threaten the townspeople. He feels sort of responsible. And he feels like he's got to protect them and protect this town. All the while, he's thinking, I should just get out of here. I should just make some dough and cut out. And so he's warring kind of with himself the whole time he's here. Part of him feels responsible for this town that he started. And part of him feels like he's just got to get out while the getting's good. Because eventually, the town people might find out what a shady character he really is, and how he doesn't own this town, and how there's definitely no gold in those mines up the hill. And so there's a lot of stuff going on in this book. And again, it's a really short book. This one's even shorter than the other one. This is 120 pages long. But there's an awful lot of story that happens in this book, in this 120 pages. And it just moves right along like a rocket. And the character work in this is really good. This is one of LAmour's better books, I thought. Because the character of Fallon was certainly an interesting character. Deep down, of course, he had a heart of gold, but he was also kind of a shady liar. And he kind of was fighting with himself for that. The whole book, he's kind of thinking, I got to cut out of here. But he's still kind of sticking around until it's almost too late. The action in this book is excellent as well. There is a scene in this book where he has to try to save some cattle that were left in the path of a flash flood. And he's got to save these cattle from this flood. And it was riveting. It was a riveting action scenes. One of the best action scenes I've read in a long, long time. I was really impressed by it. I was really impressed by this book. And as often happens when I pick up a LAmour book, I'm just impressed by LAmour. And you can see why he was so famous. You can see why our grandparents liked him so much. And how a lot of fans of Westerns just love this guy. Because he wrote some incredible, action-packed Westerns. He was not a flawless writer by any means. He was writing so fast, he occasionally made some flubs. He made some mistakes here and there, and that he would forget characters. Sometimes he would occasionally forget a plot point here or there. But all that seems so minor and basically not too noticeable for the most part with the way these stories roll right along. Really good. This is a really good story. So Fallon, I really liked this one. I liked both of these books. Both of these books were really, really good. So Louis LaMour, he is always worth a revisit. I've got an awful lot left to read for June on the Range, so this is probably all the Louis LaMour I'll read this year. But it was an awful good time reading Louis LaMour again. I'll definitely come back to him in the future. Definitely, next June on the Range, going to be reading probably a lot more. I'll probably try to fit in a lot more of Louis LaMour. He deserves it. Okay, that's all I have to say. I probably won't be around tomorrow, but catch me in a couple days or so. You guys, have a great day.